Coming up on the Men at the Movies podcast, we move into episode 4 of the Band of Brothers series, Replacements. It can be tough being the new guy, trying to find your role in a group of established veterans. You're afraid you won't measure up, afraid you don't really belong. Thankfully, there are men like Sgt Randleman who, over time, can help you develop the quiet strength that eliminates the imposter syndrome. Join us as we discover God's truth in this story.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being.
The Toccoa men, that's the ones that was there at the very beginning. They are very close, and they accept people coming in like myself as a replacement, but you also have to prove yourself.
Well, most of them we were qualified parachutists. They had to be. A lot of them were awfully green, and we knew that. We hoped we could keep them alive, or they could keep alive. A lot of them didn't. But, no, it was all right. They eventually blend right in.
I think maybe they were trying to impress the older guys, maybe people like me or Shifty, or I don't know why. But I got right there to where I didn't want to be friendly with replacements coming in because, God, I didn't like seeing them get killed. It just tore me up.
Because we were in awe of them. They were wearing infantry badges, their uniform. They had a star on their jump wings. They were like heroes to us, That's how we looked at them. And they were good. Furthermore, they were good. We had good officers for the most part, but we had excellent NCOs. They looked after you.
Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me live in the studio is my friend John. How are you doing this morning, John?
Good, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm excited to break the seal, get you in here. We've talked for a little while. You're a big fan of the Master and Commander series, and so you want to come in and talk about that sometime. So maybe not the series, just the movie.
Well, yeah, there's 20 books, so we'll have to narrow it down. The movie was pretty good.
Yeah, pretty phenomenal. So we'll get you in sometime to talk about that once you get your bearings here. We started you in easy. We're going gentle with you.
Yeah, just an episode, right?
Yeah,
you don't have to commit to a whole movie yet.
Right. That's a much bigger timepiece. Although, from what you've said, as you prepared for this, we're talking about obviously episode 4 of Band of Brothers Replacements. And as you prepped for it, you've actually ended up putting in a little more time than you had originally anticipated, I think.
Yeah, and it's been fun. When you invited me, I hadn't seen the series in, probably 10 years. I watched it with my wife, back when it was on DVD. I think we got it like from Netflix,
right?
In the mail on DVD. And, I'd seen clips from it in various settings, but to go back and rewatch. So I sat down the other night with my dad, and he and I were hanging out and realized that he hadn't seen any of the series before. And so we started from the beginning and watched through. So we're kind of halfway at this point, and it's been fun. Of course, his dad was in World War II. He was a fighter pilot. He flew out of England, bomber escort missions
cool.
In the P-51 Mustang. And so he was larger than life to my dad.
Right.
And so to see the effect of these type of settings and, these type of memories is it's interesting, to resonate with him differently than it resonated with me, because he was there,
right?
When Granddad came home, and, he was growing up seeing his dad mentioned in the newspaper whenever they would get a report from the front lines. down in Naples, Florida, they would run, a column and mention, what, Lieutenant Anderson was up to. And it was pretty cool just to enjoy something like that with him. Mm-hmm. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to introduce my dad to Band of Brothers.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that fact that, you're watching it with your dad, whose dad had been in World War II. And both of my grandparents, my grandfathers have been in World War II. One was I think a tail gunner for one of the bombers, and one was a grenadier.
Wow.
And never talked to them about it. And they both died. One died right after my son was born, so about 20 years ago now. And then my other grandfather died just a few years ago. I remember getting that call on the way to go get a Christmas tree that he had passed, and it's like, oh, give me a few minutes here.
Yeah.
One of the cool things about this is, I guess it's not really cool, but the fact that the men who were involved in World War II, we are reaching the very last limits of their we're losing touch with that generation.
Yeah.
And so, it's good to grab, if you do have a grandfather typically, or a father who is in that war, I'd encourage you to spend that time, sit down with him, ask him what it was like, the stuff that he's willing to go into and share. Because as we will see in some of these next episodes, it gets pretty ugly. It gets pretty traumatic. And to this point, we haven't really seen that. I mean, you had, episode 2, Normandy, Day of Days. That was hard. That was brutal, but that wasn't what we're going to see in Bastogne and in Breaking Point here in episode 6 and 7, where you see the brutalness of war. Up to this point, Easy Company hasn't suffered a defeat. They've suffered losses. They've suffered casualties, but they really haven't lost on the battlefield. And we're going to see in this, and then especially as we head into the next several episodes, there's a shift in the tone of the story.
Yeah.
And this is sort of the last really feel good episode, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, Market Garden, the operation that they were trying to liberate that northern route into Germany, is one that it was ambitious, and
it was a big swing.
They were just hoping to get home by Christmas.
Right.
The men were doubtful that it was going to work. You can even see in the episode as they're being briefed, they're, looking at each other like, why are we doing this? And then he says, well, if we do this and open up this route, we can get tanks into Berlin and be home by Christmas. It's like, okay, let's give it a shot. But it goes horribly.
Yeah. And really ends up with leading to, I think, the response and the counteroffensive from Germany that we'll see in episodes 6 and 7 around Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge. We talked about with the last episode what to do when fear takes over. This is sort of a respite episode in a lot of ways, because they get to go back to, we see them on leave in England. They're talking to the replacements. And that was the clip at the beginning, was both from some of the veterans. How do you respond when new guys come in? As well as new guys, how do you feel when you enter in? And that whole idea of imposter syndrome, especially for a new guy coming in. And you wrote something about this several years ago, John, about what it means to walk into the imposter syndrome and how we can defeat it. And so probably we'll talk a little bit about that today. But what is imposter syndrome, just for purposes of defining terms?
Yeah, I think we all experience it in various ways in different settings, but it's that feeling like you don't actually belong, that you're in danger of being discovered as an imposter, and that you're not actually going to measure up when tested. And so you're praying the test never comes. because you're convinced you're going to fail, and that everyone will then find out that you've been faking it the whole time.
You're going to rip that mask off and be like, wait, what are you doing here?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a different vibe that we saw last time when it's fear, where Blythe just is screaming in his foxhole. But it's a fear much more familiar to us. Most of us aren't under fire, literally.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll go into a meeting having no idea what we're doing there. We'll be talking with people being like, what am I even doing in this conversation? I am so outclassed. I'm so unprepared, uninitiated, whatever term you want to use, and you're in danger of being exposed.
Mm-hmm. I think it's that fear of exposure that causes men like Sobel to posture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for him to be a bully gives him power, because he's probably a very powerless man in the rest of his life. And he's found this opportunity. Yeah. And he's just, you know, you can see in those previous episodes when they were in training and he actually had to jump, he was terrified.
Right.
When he was doing land nav, he was just completely out of his depth.
Yeah.
And he was desperate not to get found out, even though it was completely obvious to everyone around him.
Right. Even when he took Winters to the side, he's like, you're making me look foolish. You're making me look bad. I'm like, nope. Nobody thought that but
that
you.
all by yourself.
Yeah. I don't need to do anything. You're doing a great job. And so I want to start with a clip. It's in the bar. And we're going to have two different scenes from the bar. We'll talk about the second one here in a few minutes. But the first one is the old hands, the sergeants, the squad leaders, right? Basically, or team leaders, whatever they might be in that day and age. They're together. And they're kind of talking over the new guys, because Sgt Randleman, he's the big burly guy, got a cigar in his mouth. He knows what's what. He walks with an air of confidence. He walks with a swagger, but he doesn't suffer from imposter syndrome, even though they kind of make fun of him for being a hayseed and having a country accent and stuff. We'll see this. And I just love this scene. This is probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole series, because it shows both the camaraderie of men who have gone through battle together. And then as they interact with these new guys who are sitting there at the table, and Garnier comes in and kind of, he's like, let me go warm them up for you. And this whole, the whole scenario, I will throw out the caveat. This is a spicy scene. Garnier curses a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I try to give a heads up if we're going to go with some language alerts. But there's a depth to this that I want to kind of talk about on the backside of this.
They're just serious fighting man, that's all.
Well, I think I'm going to go introduce myself.
Careful what you say now. Don't take much to set my guys off.
Yeah, you got some wild-eyed killers right there, boy. Hey, fellas. What do you hear? What do you say?
Actually, it's Babe Seat, Private Heffern's.
Is that right? Don't care if it's fucking Eisenhower's. Who are you?
Private Miller, James Miller. I'm in Sgt Randleman's squad.
Us too. I'm Les Ashy.
Tony Garcia. I know you are. Oh, gonorrhea, don't miss nothing. So, Heffron tell you about Doris yet?
No.
Huh? Mm-hmm. Well, then I'm going to educate you. Getting ready to get on a plane for that first frog town we never jumped into. All of a sudden, Heffron stops dead in his tracks. Banging and banging and banging, everybody banging into each other and everything. Heffron's just staring up at the nose of the plane because on it painted this beautiful pinup. And written underneath, Darling Doris. Doris just happens to be the name. But a skirt, who just that day sent Babe one of them letters. You know, what do you call them letters that the broad send?
Dear John letter.
That's it. A Dear Babe letter. Well, anyway, lucky for Babe, Patton overruns our drop zone. Mission canceled. In other words, Babe don't have to risk getting inside old Doris again. Hey, Bull, your squad listens up real good.
Yeah, being polite, like whenever Bull opens his mouth.
Johnny, what are you saying? Bull's boys are just humoring him?
Yeah, like whenever he gives out some of his folksy wisdom from back down on the farm.
Probably think he's a fucking hayseed. They're right.
What are you laughing at?
You new boys, you pay attention to Sergeant Randleman. Got that? That's the smartest man in the company.
I really liked how the new guys identified themselves as, we're in Sergeant Randleman's squad. And when he referred to them a moment earlier, he said, those are my guys. And he had taken an older brother or a fatherly view of them, even though they were overdressed and undertrained and didn't know which end of the gun to put where. They were his guys.
That was he took ownership of them, and they knew how to, like, hey, we're with him.
Yeah. You notice that was one of the things that they did when they started getting, busted into a little bit. They were like, hey, we're with him. Does that help?
Yeah. Which, again, when you're imposter syndrome, you're like, whose coattails can I grab hold of to bring me entry into, and as we'll see through the course of this episode, entry into until I have the opportunity to prove myself.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You see these guys, you got Sergeant Martin, you've got Garnier, you've got Bull, you've got Babe. He's there talking, and they're sort of looking over there, and that's what Garnier says is, let me educate you. That's part of the path of initiation. And, even at the end when Sergeant Martin's like, what are you laughing at? He doesn't do it mean-spiritedly. Because even after he says that, what can't be captured on audio is sort of the giggle that he has after he says it, as knowing he just scared the pants off him.
Mm-hmm.
But this, they're there. It's sort of that idea of like, oh, I can make fun of my brother, but don't you make fun of my brother.
Right.
Because, they're talking about his folksy wisdom and his hayseed. You think he's a hayseed. Well, you're right. But then to come back and say, that's the smartest guy in the unit. You guys need to listen to him.
Mm-hmm. And I like how Randleman doesn't feel like he has to respond to those quips. And he also doesn't have to try to prove that he has what it takes. He just has a quiet strength.
Right. And so we have this men's retreat that we're involved with, that if you've tracked with this podcast for any length, you've heard us talk about the Carolina Outpost. And that's where I met John over 10 years ago, as we walked in this. And to me, when I first started this, I was like, hey, John, I want you to do episode 4. I want you to do replacements, because in my mind, John is Sergeant Randleman. He's got that quiet strength. Even one of the guys in our groups the other day is one of the guys is struggling with work, and it's like, what really helps with work? A trip with John Anderson. It's like, that's great for kind of sorting things out, is just hanging out. And you and I have been up fishing several times, some camping trips, and we've had a lot of time together over the years.
A lot of windshield time.
That takes some of the pressure off. You can have some conversations where you don't feel locked in of staring at each other. And there's periods of silence, and there's periods of laughter and stories and all that. And one of the reasons that sort of in my mind I associate you with Bull is at our men's retreat, we have small groups, and there's a trail guide for each small group. And certain men have an impact. We all have impacts. Certain men have a different impact, where you'll see guys come back 4 or 5 times and say, yeah, the first time I came, I was in John Anderson's group, or the first time I came, I was in Travis Carter's or Ricky's group. There are guys that, like, their names keep popping up. It's like, oh yeah, this guy, Ricky will still tell the story of the first time and he threw his Bible at you because you pissed him off. Again, that quiet strength, because you were just sitting there refilling your pipe.
Just asked him a question and waited to see what would happen.
Yeah. And you were dodging fire in your own way there. But that question, that quiet strength that you mentioned, that I see in you over the years, it doesn't come overnight. And I guess the question of the podcast is, how do we saw Private Blythe last time, guy freaking out, scared in his foxhole. How can we move from a man like Blythe, or even these young guys who are scared, to become a guy who exudes quiet strength, who can be a Sgt Randleman, who doesn't have to prove himself, who doesn't suffer from imposter syndrome?
It's interesting to hear you describe, the impact on the guys at the outpost, and equating that with a perceived lack of imposter syndrome. Because I think a lot of times the men who are offering strength may not realize it and may be feeling like an imposter the whole time. I certainly did those first few outposts, when I'm leading a group. You mentioned Travis and Ricky, and I had both of those guys in my groups early on, and they're dear friends. But I was just praying that I could offer them something that would be helpful. And it was by no prearranged strategy of mine that they have experienced the life change that they've experienced over the years. The Holy Spirit was at work, and I was trying to stay out of the way. And for me, that's one of the places where I sometimes struggle to see the impact that I'm having. Even just the other night around the fire, one of our brothers in our group, told me that I had been really encouraging, and that, he had really appreciated my encouragement before he gave a presentation. And I remembered doing it, and I kind of remembered what I said, but I wasn't going out of my way to try to do something that was going to be so, stand out or noticeable. It's just what was on my heart. And so I shared it with him. And I'm grateful to be able to make that kind of an impact, and to have something to offer that doesn't feel like I have to force it, or try to be someone who I'm not. Because I spent many years trying to be someone who I wasn't, to try to fit in, to gain approval, to be allowed to be part of the in group. And so to be told that I'm making an impact when I feel like I'm just being myself is really encouraging.
And that's a really important piece, even of this scene. Like, Sergeant Martin couldn't sit down and have that conversation with those guys, have that impact that Garnier did. And certainly not Bull. Like, he's not going to do that. And I think a lot of guys experience stress when that camaraderie, that bond, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not, especially I think in our instant culture.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, oh man, look at that. I want that. We were even talking beforehand about seeing the stuff of other people. This guy's got this car, this house, or multiple houses, or this sort of life. But there's a reason. Like, there's a reason that this guy has a mountain house. It's because he's 20 years older than us and is reaping the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's because this guy is traveling 4 nights out of 5. He's working his ass off.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's great. He has that because he needs that when he's not working. He has to have somewhere else to go. But we frequently want what they have without going through the work.
Right.
And I see that with relationships as well. We want that. And you mentioned the striving, the chasing. How do I fit in? How can I belong? Like those, new privates that are sitting around the table. They'll do anything to fit in. They'll do anything to feel like they belong. which actually works against you, right? There's a guy who's like, dude, you're trying too hard.
Yeah.
Just be yourself and relax.
Yeah.
And trust God to allow that to happen.
Calm down and realize that your entire worth and value isn't riding on this next turn of events.
On the next thing out of your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the other part is to this point in the story, these guys have been through battle together. So you've got pain, you've got loss. Remember what the guy said is, I didn't want to get close to replacements because I didn't want to.
It was too hard on me to watch them die.
Yeah. Well, that means that he's gone through loss already.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it sort of takes is it's like a good chili. You can't make it in an hour.
Mm-hmm.
It might be chili, but it's not going to be good chili.
Mm-hmm.
You got to let that puppy sit. You're not making a brisket in a microwave. A good brisket's going to take a while.
And it's going to need some heat and some smoke, right?
Yes. Low heat. And, that's interesting too, because in battle, that's sort of a high heat, high pressure situation.
It's more like a pressure cooker that tenderizes in a hurry.
Right. But you're not going to get the smoke that sort of the flavor that soaks in and absorbs into the meat.
Well, and I think a lot of the time, looking at the story, these guys were tested in battle, yes, but they had been with each other for 2 years in training.
Right.
They called them the Tekoa men.
Right.
And the replacements, it certainly had not gone through that level of training. They were jump qualified, like the guy said. They had parachutist wings, but they were green as grass. And they were still trying to figure out which end of the rifle to point at the bad guy.
Right. And
that level of responsibility for someone, I think it's kind of similar to what we do in the outpost, because, you get some guys in your group and you're like, hey, we're going to get into some deep water. There's going to be the reality of life that comes to the surface. And I want to handle this man's heart well. And I don't want him to walk away from this experience with deeper wounds or salt,
right,
in his wounds. But we're going to have to cut deep if we're going to be able to heal.
Right.
And that it requires a subtle approach. Sometimes you have to go soft. Sometimes you have to go hard.
And I think that takes us to our next clip, where immediately after this interaction, one of those privates has an organizational, regimental ribbon on for the work they did in Normandy. And this Cobb, who is seriously suffering from imposter syndrome, you see it in everything he does, everything he says. He comes up and has an interaction. But then, as you mentioned, that soft touch that Bull calls him out on it, but he doesn't call him out at the beginning. He calls him out at the end. So this is that interaction.
Where'd you get that? It's a Presidential Distinguished Unit citation for what the regiment did in Normandy.
That's right.
For what the regiment did. You weren't there.
Hey, ease up, Cobb. It's a unit citation.
Shit, Cobb. You didn't fight Normandy neither.
I got hit with the plane before I got a chance to jump.
So, John, we see here that gentle touch that you mentioned, because Bull doesn't go and confront Cobb in front of everybody. He doesn't break him down and embarrass him further, because that would just, as you mentioned earlier, sort of harden him to correction.
Mm-hmm.
But he does, and we can't see it. I mean, you can, but not on the podcast.
Right.
But he picks up the ribbon to return it. My guess is privately, to do sort of the same thing, to build him up in private, because How would addressing each of those, both the correction of Cobb and the restoration to the other private, how would that, why should that be done privately and not publicly there in the moment?
Well, I think Randleman has the ability to see the reason that Cobb is picking on these guys is because he feels like he doesn't deserve the very same citation ribbon that he's wearing. Because I thought it was so ironic in the clip that the guy is sitting there, busting the balls with the guy who wasn't there when he technically wasn't there either.
Right.
I mean, sure, he got wounded in the plane on the flight in, so he never hit the jump zone, and he's carrying the shame of that, and it's oozing out all around, every interaction that he's having. He's trying to prove that he still belongs. Randleman knew that if he came in and, busted his pose, that would probably do more harm than good.
Right.
But at the same time, he wanted to let him know, hey, we all know what you're doing. We can understand what's happening here. You weren't there either.
Yeah.
But I liked the fact that he waited until the other guys had gone, because he wanted to correct him, kind of peer to peer.
Yeah.
As opposed to demeaning him in front of others. And you see that in Randleman's character throughout, where he operates in a way where he doesn't demean the people around him.
And that's powerful, because our tendency is to react and respond, to correct in the moment, which would just make it worse. Like, Cobb's already feeling like he's an imposter. He's feeling like he doesn't belong. And if Bull had called him out in the moment, he would have just made it worse. Instead of taking him to the side, shit, Cobb, you weren't there either. And almost that arm around him. Like, he's a part of the regiment now. You're a part of the regiment. You weren't there, but you still belong.
Yeah, you both have an equal place here.
Right.
But don't try to take from him what you're desperate not to lose yourself.
Right. Right, because that's that whole mindset of scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, there's only so much belonging to go around. There's only so much, accomplishment to go around. And if this guy can do it, like he's trying to prove that he's worthy by saying he's not. When the truth is, they're both worthy to wear the regimental patch because they're part of the regiment. Like, that's how it works. Like, if you were in a regiment today, you could wear stuff that was earned in World War I, in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam. Like, you're a part of that history. You're part of the larger story. And that's what Bull was welcoming them into is, yeah, you belong. You're a part of this. You don't have to earn it. And the interesting thing is, by speaking that into them at that moment, you actually create the opportunity for them to earn it. And I'm going to play a little compilation of clips here as I go into Holland, as I drop in, both in preparation and then boots on the ground. We see these short little interactions with Sgt Randleman as he's going with, whether it's a kid struggling with his, how to sling his weapon in the airplane. When he lands, he can't get the parachute off. Even, the third sound you hear is a guy who's fixing his bayonet as they're walking across a field. And in each case, Sgt Randleman interacts in a way that corrects, but not, again, in a demeaning way, but to say, and there's one phrase in particular that I want to jump on afterwards.
Sling it up and down. When you hit the ground, your knee will hit the butt. The business end will break your jaw. All right? Lose your reserves. You won't need it. We're jumping low. Take your belly band, wrap it around you. Fine. Sorry. Don't be sorry. Grab your rifle. Let's go. Won't be able to shoot it straight with that thing on.
He's not trying to treat them as if they should have known something that he learned through combat. He's trying to protect them and do it in a way that preserves their dignity and honor. And I really appreciate the approach that Randleman takes, because it's so much like a big brother, a kind older brother who
not one that's going to give you swirlies every day.
Right. Yeah. Who is, maybe coming back from college and, has learned some things, and he's like, hey, don't try to do that. This is how it's going to go. Learn from me, do it this way. And, you had asked earlier, who is someone who did that for me? And the person that came to mind is a guy that I've learned a lot from and really look up to. And I'll give you just a little bit of backstory. So years ago, I used to play competitive airsoft and had been playing in backyards and in the woods with my buddies. And, we started to enjoy doing the military simulation side of things. And so we formed a team, and we were going to our first big event, where we'd be with, a couple hundred others. And we were doing a big reenactment of a scenario. And so we didn't know what we were doing. We'd never been to a big op, and there was a lot of posturing. And, we walk in and everybody's got a swagger, and everybody's uniforms are, looking so fancy and squared away. And, the funny thing about airsoft is most people, including myself, who play, we're not in the military. And so, it is a playing make believe to a certain extent. But I got to meet a guy who was in, and he is someone who came up and gave us advice in a way that was very much like Randleman. We're like, hey, if you guys go on down there, there's a unit set up to ambush. Come around here with us. We're going to flank them. And just we're trying to wander through, find the bad guys so that we can get into, some kind of a firefight. And he's like, yeah, you're walking into an ambush. Come on. And, his call sign is win. And he's very much a kind older brother figure. And, he's a firearms trainer, and most of the advanced shooting training that I've ever done has been with him. And so he's taught, some of my daughters to shoot. He's the kind of guy who looks around and sees who needs help, and then doesn't go over and make you feel ashamed for needing help. He comes and says, hey, let me teach you something.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate his approach, because it makes you feel like you're okay. He's there to help you, and he's not going to embarrass you or call you out. Although, once you've been there for a while and you ought to know better, he'll call you out in front of the firing line. But that's that same kind of camaraderie, that back and forth. He doesn't do that if he knows that you're not ready for it.
Right.
And so, if he calls you out, it's almost a compliment, because that means, hey, I've taught you better, and I know you can take this correction.
And what we see so many times is, like, you can offer somebody to help, but if you're doing it out of, again, that imposter syndrome, where you're trying to show how much you know by telling somebody else what they're screwing up on, that comes across.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene we didn't play where Cobb's telling them about it, but he's telling them in a very condescending and authoritative manner, not in a way that Bull does, where he's like, at the end, you'll be fine. The guy about getting ready to jump for his first combat jump. You'll be fine. And then the second one is, don't be sorry. Just get your rifle. Come on. No need to. Why do you apologize for not knowing something you've never done before?
Mm-hmm.
And yet we still have that we have that approach, right? It's like, oh man, everything's not straight away. When I look at the home studio as it's falling down around us, the foam is falling off the cardboard and all this. And it's like, oh man, I should have this, set up with the walls and all this. Like there's that sense of striving with, I don't have everything. Right. I don't have a home studio because I live here. This is my fortress of solitude down here. Like, I don't want foam walls. I want walls. I have stuff all over the walls reminding me of things that I love. And to not have that sense of less than, to not have, and I have done some conversations where I felt embarrassed because it's like, oh man, this guy probably has done professional interviews before. He knows how jacked up and amateurish I am. That's all right. It's okay to have foam falling off the cardboard and to not have $500 microphones or to do all the things. Because one, I found over the course of years, my equipment has improved. I've got stuff to do some pretty cool things, but I didn't get it all right away. You're not going to have an amazing bar the first time because you can't afford it. But if you buy one bottle at a time, as it builds up, and relationally, that works the same way. You're not going to have these amazing relationships in month one. And I got bad news, or year one. Well, I've been with these guys a year. Yeah, guess what? You just met. It's when you start hitting that decade mark of guys that you really start building that bond. And it accelerates for these guys because they're in war.
Sure. Like pressure cooker, like we talked about before. Let me interrupt you.
Yeah, man.
This studio is special. And it's not special because it's got fancy walls or expensive microphones. It's special because you're in it. And your guests come here to talk to you because you are doing something that matters and you're offering something to the world and you're growing in that and you have something to offer. So when we come and we sit here together, I didn't come to be impressed by your fancy equipment. I came to talk with my friend.
Yeah.
Because I love you and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. It was interesting when we were doing our pre-talk, texting back and forth. Hey man, what are you thinking? What are you seeing? And your response was exactly that. I'm just showing up to talk with my friend. I was like, oh, that feels nice. It's like a fleece lined flannel coat on a cold winter morning.
Yeah. And the point of these episodes and the discussions that we're having, it's not to try to teach somebody something. I think it's to try to invite people into a way of living. And we've lived and walked that path for a long time together. And I've seen you from that first time that you showed up at the outpost to the man that you are today. And, it's night and day. You are offering from a depth of strength and a reservoir of character that I'm sure, more than a decade ago, you would have never imagined. And you would have looked at the guys that had what you thought you wanted and thought you could never get there. And mile by mile, you've done the work.
I told you guys he was bull. But that's it. And so actually that's an amazing tee up for our final clip.
I meant it that way.
Yeah, oh, sure. Because when we first got to know each other, I was that new guy in the message, in learning what it was to walk with Christ, in being a follower, not a religious whatever. And you're somebody who I could emulate. He's like, you do have a strength of character. You do have a passion for growth, passion for men, for seeing men's hearts come alive. And I was like, oh man, there's something just like Bull, just like Sergeant Martin, just like Garnier in these episodes. It's like, man, there's something about those guys. And their personalities have been framed by training, by warfare, to become the men that they are. And so over the course of time, we see that just like the privates looking up at these sergeants, these battle-hardened veterans, eventually there comes a time, and we see that in this episode, Bull gets separated from the unit. He spends a night in a barn. Sort of the funny thing is he manages to get back on his own. But that's not really what the message is. Because in the middle of the night, these privates who are sitting there in the bar say, we don't know where Bull is, but we're with him. Right? We're Sergeant Randleman's squad. We've got to go see where he is. We got to go find him. We can't just lay here back safe, bivouacked in the company headquarters.
Yeah, he was missing in action.
Right.
And they didn't know if he'd been killed, but they were going to go find out, even though they were scared to death to go back into that town where, they'd watched one of their guys get shot in the face.
Right. And so we see at the end, Bull comes back. They sort of come back in like riding on a triumphant Jeep. And we see Sergeant Martin, and he's like, oh, look, hey, Johnny, look. He's like, Bull. But the reaction of because he doesn't know that his squad was out looking for him. He just they stumbled together. But I just love this scene as we wrap up, this idea that, and like I said, he ended up getting home on his own, but there's a distinct possibility, and the reality for all of us is that he had to pour into the people of his squad so that they could react when he was in a time.
Hey, Johnny. What, get a little lost? Something like that. It's good to see you. Me too.
I don't know whether to slap you, kiss you, or salute you. I told these scallywags you was okay.
Well, they didn't listen?
These salty bastards, they wanted to go on a suicide run to drag your ass back.
Is that right?
Yeah, I told them don't bother.
Never did like this company, none.
And immediately after that, all the rest of the company sort of swarms around this impromptu rescue squad, and they're introducing each other, and they are welcomed in as brothers, as peers, as equals. Because they're like, oh, now you know what it takes. You're willing to go in to face your fears, to go pursue a lost guy. When I think back over the years of our friendship, and as you mentioned, becoming the man that I am still becoming, but much closer to that person than I was 10 years ago, how we've engaged with job frustrations and with loss, and how I've been there with you as you're going through things like that windshield time, as we're both processing the shit going on in our lives, so that we can then go back into the fray, so that we can go back into the battle. And there's a confidence that we both have of knowing, hey, this guy has my back, even my ugly stuff, even the stuff I've got to apologize for later. Because the interesting thing is, like, relationships don't go easy. They don't actually grow unless there's conflict.
Yeah, you've got to have mileage, and mileage wears out tires and makes things need to get fixed.
Right.
And, you know that you've been through enough with someone as you've walked together over the years that person isn't going away just because there's a bump in the road. Because it's not the first one you've been over together.
Right. There might be some radio silence for a couple of days, but as the time goes, it actually, that goes away. I remember a buddy I had in the Army, and we'd work together. And a very similar situation as I was becoming more experienced as a nurse, as a leader. He was out for a couple months with back problems. So I was the charge nurse. And so it was like, for those months he wasn't there, he'd come back in and criticize some of my decisions, or, what are you doing? That's a dumb idea. It would piss me off. And this was a guy, like, we're in the military, so we have to maintain some semblance of physical fitness. And so after our shifts, we'd work nights, we'd go out, we'd go running. Then, after we run, we go get breakfast tacos because we're in San Antonio and the food's amazing. And he'd be like, hey, man, we're going to run today? I was like, nah, I'm good. But invariably, on our 10-minute drive home, because we both lived on base, one of us would call the other one, say, hey, man, you want to go get breakfast? Like, yeah, you pissed me off. And that's okay. I'm not going to let that little bump in the road derail this relationship. And we've had some of those moments. And one of the things I've learned through one of the recent bumps is, and I told you, I was like, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad towards you. Like I was mad about something entirely different, but you just happened to be the needle that popped the balloon. And so as we close the episode, any words of encouragement for guys out there who are like, man, I'd love an older brother. I'm looking for a bull, a Sgt Randleman in my life. They feel like the new private sitting at the table. And, in a lot of ways they're feeling, or even like Cobb, like I'm a part of this group, but I don't feel a part of this group. How do I become, I guess, the man I want to become? How do I belong? Which is that's a
big
longer
question.
That's a bigger question
than the man
than
I want to become
right.
as we close.
Yeah, just wrap it up in like a 30-second soundbite.
Maybe I'll speak to imposter syndrome in that. Do the thing you're afraid of being exposed about anyway. Because one of the things I think that helps over years of dealing with imposter syndrome is actually getting exposed isn't as bad as you think. If you go into it knowing, I don't know what I'm doing, and so I'm going to try to be honest about that. And I think that there's the way that God brings people into our lives is usually in the ways that he knows that we need them when we acknowledge to ourselves that we also have a need. And so allowing ourselves to be in a position where we need encouragement, where we need training, where we need the advice of that older brother, getting ourselves out of the self-protective mode, because if we never risk being exposed, we'll never have the older brother come and put his arm around us and say, hey, don't do it that way. Let me save you from the, pain, or pulling you up, after you've fallen and saying, hey, try it this way next time. So trying to self-protect ultimately blocks us from ever being able to experience what we actually want.
And for some of us, that might mean speaking up when you have a tendency to not. Or for mine, putting my hand over my mouth, because I frequently would want to say, look how smart I am. Look what I have to offer. And so there are physically times I put my hand over my mouth to say, it's not my time to talk. Because talking is that false motivator, that imposter trying to be like, look at me, look at me. And so, like you said, do that thing that you're afraid of doing. And, for me, who's can be afraid of being invisible, being silent, unless, hey, Paul, what do you think? That's my way of saying, making sure that I was like, you know what? I'm not going to offer out of my sense of scarcity or loss or my sense of being Cobb. It's how do I grow into that man, whether it's Garnier or Bull, to welcome those guys in to the brotherhood, to the fellowship. And really, that's just of knowing me, right? Of knowing you, of like, that's how you do it. It's like, hey, this is who I am. And really, if that's like, oh man, like, I don't like that dude that much, I don't want to hang out with you. It's like, let's get this out of the way early. It's like, oh man, you have some good thoughts, but it's like, you're not my type.
Yeah, not everybody gets to be close with everybody.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. So John, thank you for hopping over on a chilly Saturday morning and hanging out and having this conversation. As I mentioned before, is like one of our friends, his wife listens to the podcast and said, "Oh, that sounded like a sort of a close conversation between two good friends." I'm like, that's actually what I'm looking for. So that's what this has been for us this morning. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Paul. This was fun.
And I look forward to hitting Master and Commander some point in the future.
Love to.
It might be a 2-parter as you deep dive into all the little nuances of the books and stuff. And it's like, no, we're talking about the movie. So this has been Paul McDonald and John Anderson talking about Band of Brothers Replacements, that 4th episode. And so make sure you join us next time here on the Men of the Movie podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?